all is important to us.
Hello and welcome to tonight's show.
You've arrived at your destination. Connecting.
Hi guys, welcome to Glitched in the Code here on iconic.com, and you'll be watching us on YouTube and BitChute, and you'll be hearing this on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and many others. I'm here with author Gary Wayne, author of The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, How Secret Societies and the Descendants of the Giants Plan to Enslave Mankind. And he's got a new book out, which we will coming out soon. We'll speak about towards the end and a few other bits. But Gary, thank you for your time, mate. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me to your podcast, and very much looking forward to introducing myself to your audience and to the discussion that we're going to have today, because I think they're going to find it not only interesting, but maybe raise a few eyebrows and hopefully some curiosity along the line.
It's fascinating because all the different takes on this, and they obviously all go back to the Garden of Eden, the different takes on the Nephilim and the fallen angels. And you have a Christian take, you have a Gnostic take, you have a astrotheology take, and everyone's got their kind of understandings of what's going on here. But I think all of them across the board kind of understand that something else has happened to the human race at some point, and we're not getting the whole story. So from your perspective, let's have a look. So let's start from what happened here with this descendants of the Nephilim, and then Cain and Abel, and that sort of around about that time, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, it's a good place to start, and it's really, I think, important, good to underscore that when we talk about giants, and they have many different names around the world, that in itself ought to open the door and get people thinking about this is not just a biblical mythos. If for people who are non-Christians, I think it's accurate. And I know a lot of people in the church don't accept as well that there are actually physical giants. That's a different rabbit hole to go down. But this is one of the common legacies that comes down through our prehistory and our history. It's on all continents around the world, except for Antarctica. And who knows what we're going to find there down the road. It is the same as the flood that is in all cultures, all continents around the world, just like the people are, just like pyramids are. There's a significant number of things that is a common heritage. It's seen through different lenses around the world. There is a monotheist lens that a Christian would look at it from, or somebody of Judaism or Islam would look at it through. There is a polytheist lens that all of the pantheons and religions around the world will look through it through. And then there is a secular lens that people view the same events. And then there are, the ancient alien mythos lens that people will look at it. And they're really talking about all of the same events. They just have a different lens that they view it through. So what I try and do in my research is I try and connect those dots so that people understand that this is a common legacy. And it's important to understand because it's recorded everywhere, and it has an impact all through our history into today, and from a Christian prophetic perspective into the end time. So it's important that we sort of understand that. And so the giants first show up before the flood. And the flood's really important to understand. And it's a dividing point in terms of history that's recorded in all the accounts except for the secular account, which just are sort of ignoring it, and they create a secular chronology without it in there. But it gets rather confusing unless you know what happened before the flood and what happened after the flood. And if you don't, then, particularly when you get into the polytheist lenses where you have parent gods and offspring gods and things like that, it just gets like it gets contradictory if you don't understand the important sort of time marks that are concurrent all around the world. So we have a time that happens that we call in prehistory that happens before the flood. And in this period, you have a creation of the earth in all religions around the world. You have a creation of humankind, and you have a creation of giants. And from a biblical perspective, the giants will show up several generations into the 10 generations before the flood. And again, 10 generations, 10 kings, it's an antediluvian constant. And when I say antediluvian, that means before the flood. It's just sort of an antiquated word it's not used that often these days. And it happens in the 6th generation, beginning in the times of Jared, as it's talked about in the book of Enoch, or in the days of Noah, as it would be talked about in the Bible. And so it happens after Adam and Eve, after Cain and Abel, after Seth, and then into the generations from there. But it's important to also understand about the concept of what was going on in the world in terms of the background culture of the world, the organizational structure, and its religious basis before the giants show up. So you have the descendants of Cain, who most Christians think, and I tend to agree, and I support that in my book, that it's the daughters of Cain that are going to intermarry with the fallen angels or the gods of the pantheon in polytheism and create the Nephilim. They're called heroes in Greek mythology. They're called the earthly Anunnaki. They're the earthly Titans. They are the demigods of old, and demigods of old is defined as the offspring of a god and a human female. So we're talking about the same things that is going on in Genesis 6:1-4. That is the preamble to the flood story and the cause of the flood story. And so you have the descendants of Cain, and included in those descendants is his first son, which is very, very important to understand this period of time. And his name is Enoch. And what most people don't understand, and maybe they do, they just don't really maybe think about it, is there's 2 Enochs in prehistory. There's Enoch, first son of Cain, and there's Enoch, son of Jared. And they're 2 separate Enochs.
And that's the book of Enoch, the son of Jared. Is that right?
Yes, and there's several books of Enoch as well. And they're a little bit contradictory to each other and a little bit contradictory to the Bible in some cases. And first Enoch tends to be the most consistent biblically, even though we don't have an original Hebrew manuscript for it. I think there might be a few corruptions in it, but we don't have the original Hebrew to establish its full veracity, but there's enough there to say that there's a lot there. When you get into 2nd Enoch, 3rd Enoch, and the Enochian Book of Giants, from which the Manichaean Book of Giants comes from, allegedly the Lost King of Og, and books like that, you have a very significant polytheist influence. Again, talking about the same set of events, but interjecting polytheism into it. Whereas the book of Enoch is mostly talked about, well, it is talked about from a monotheist sort of perspective. And it's Enoch, son of Cain, who is going to prepare the way for the giants. Mm-hmm. So he inherits knowledge according to the Gnostics account and the secret societies account, what comes out of the Polychronicon of ancient masonry. He's going to get the knowledge from Cain that Cain had inherited from Adam, who inherited and was taught knowledge from God to run this massive agricultural center that had rivers like the Nile in it, the Euphrates, 2 other rivers. He did ranching, he did orchards, he did massive crops, all things that he would have needed a lot of knowledge that God had taught him, including astronomy and knowledge like that to do the things that he needed to do, because there's only Adam and then later Eve. So obviously if he didn't have technology and knowledge, probably wasn't going to be able to do it properly, right? So that knowledge gets passed on to Cain, passed on to Enoch, and Enoch is a great patriarch of the Gnostics and a great patriarch of the secret societies, who also wrote scripture, but polytheist scripture. And he creates 7 disciplines out of this knowledge he inherits. And it's divided into the 7 sacred sciences that is going to be then overlaid with rituals and allegories, which is the polytheist religion that is Enochian mysticism, and it's the sun-worshipping bull cult of the antediluvian epoch. And it's housed to protect this knowledge that they're going to develop. And then it's going to later merge with in the book of Enoch with the knowledge, the illicit knowledge from heaven, from the fallen angels. And in polytheism, it's the knowledge from the gods. And that's going to accelerate their technology significantly. And they're going to protect it within mysticism, which is a hierarchical, mystical degree order to protect it from the mundane and the people that they don't want to have the knowledge, basically the poor and the slaves, right? Just for the elite. And out of this, you're going to get the mystery schools that are going to develop those disciplines. And within that, the secret societies, just as you have that same model today with all of these houses like Beta House and stuff like that, and secret societies like the Skull of Bones operating out of that, where the secret societies are born. And that's where Freemasonry and Masonic history takes their beginnings back to, is the patriarch of Enoch and the descendants of Enoch, like Tubal-Cain and Lamech. And there are 2 Lamechs in the book of Genesis as well as the offspring of Jubal, and Nama of Lamech. So they're very important patriarchs before the flood. And out of this culture and out of this religion and out of this lineage comes the daughters that are going to be well prepared, because they're honoring the pantheon of gods. They're going to offer their daughters to the sons of God. And biblically, it's kind of noted that it's the sons of God who choose those human females to copulate with. But at the same time, I think it's a sort of a cultural thing that they're trying to do, because what they would like to do is take over the whole world. And with the introduction of the giants, of the demigods, they are going to usurp all of the kingships in the antediluvian world. That however many civilizations that there were, and there was probably at least 4. I look at more like 7, but you get a lot of polytheist mythos coming down in entertainment and literature, that there could be 9, there could be 11, more than 7. But the only thing I can say for sure, I think, is that you start to name some of these civilizations, there's about 7. And they're going to be the kings over this whole world. And that is that organizational structure that is set up before the flood. And they are going to, according to Plato and Critias and Timaeus in his accounts of the Greek history and with Atlantis, that the giants were more populous than the humans. That's how fast they were able to originally populate. It's a little bit different story after the flood. And they usurp the world and they enslave humankind. And they start off, in most accounts in polytheism, as being righteous and being like their offspring, or their parents as being the offspring, the spirits offspring of the gods. But then they grow evil, and then they turn against humankind. And that's basically the antediluvian story. And that violence and the wars that they cause is what brings about the flood, either by the gods of the pantheon or the God of the Bible, depending on what lens that you're looking at it through. And that within that context, you have this interesting helm of world government that was the model of the society before the flood, which was Atlantis. So that's why it has that continuing sort of mythos, because that was the golden age when the gods walked amongst humankind, produced their demigod offspring, and shared all of their knowledge, and took that civilization to a level that perhaps we haven't even caught up to today. So that's sort of a opening, sort of setting the table for the people.
So that is you're looking at Atlantis and Lemuria and these type of places, and these are different kingdoms or kingships that possibly were at war with each other, or they were or struggling for different. They were kind of sharing the place, but it seems to be there was different kind of beings in these places.
They were a little bit different, but basically the same sort of, I think, setup, just different branches of the same. Lemuria is looked at as, in some accounts, as part of that world, but in other mythoses, they are the parent civilization that will begin the other antediluvian civilizations that will spread around the world. So, but they seem to be this ancient civilizations. So you have rivalries that are happening, even though it's the same pantheon. And that's another thing that most people don't understand about polytheism is you have the same 7 gods that are sort of honored at the top, and it's the wandering stars. They have different vernacular names in each pantheon, but they seem to be the same god with almost the same responsibilities. There's a few, changes here or there, but so, if you have a parent god by the name of Kronos as part of the 12 original Olympians, you're going to have a counterpart, let's say, for an example, in Sumeria, which would be the god An or Anu, and the producer of the original sort of Anunnaki gods, right? So you have that same sort of understanding with the offspring gods that somehow take over and somehow kill the gods, which I don't think actually happens because they're immortal. So I think they actually went off to the abyss prison. And then after the flood, I think these offspring gods take over after the flood, which sort of again underlines not confusing the two, even though they'll inherit all the same sort of titles that their parents had and a lot of that mythos. You have to understand that there were two separate gods there. So you would have, for example, Zeus in the Greek pantheon, which would be Osiris as a offspring god in Egyptian, and would be like Enlil or Enki in the Sumerian pantheon, Baal in the Canaanite pantheon. In that pantheon, El is the parent god or the head chief god of the parent gods. So you have that similar sort of organizational structure, and they all have, as I say, similar sort of titles.
So this, what's standing there when you go across all of these different ones, and you obviously got astrotheology there as well. But there are some people that believe that these kind of gods were really the stars, and it's names of the stars, Kronos being Saturn. You had Osiris, you had Venus, and you have a Horus as well, and being Pluto. I mean, is there what is your kind of take on these gods actually just being names for the stars?
Yes, they are considered stars and planets, actually both. So the more important gods have a planet as well as a star.
Okay.
Right. So you have the star that's part of the starry host as the allegory. And that stars in the Bible are referred to as angels as well. You have to distinguish when it's talking about stars and when it's talking about angels in those applications. They are the wandering stars, as they're also called, which is the seven. And that seven of the ones that tend to be talked about, include, a god of the sun, a god of the moon, a god or a goddess of Venus, Mercury, Mars, and Jupiter, right? So they get seven. And typically what's interesting about those seven is they will include parent gods and offspring gods in there. And again, that's why if you don't understand that they're holding the same titles, just at different periods of time. And then typically you have, all those seven stars that sort of represented in the 7 days of the week. So there's a high seven angels or gods everywhere that you look.
So being able to communicate this, obviously they were writing this down. They were talking about these as allegories and stories of ways to communicate. So then we're getting to the age. Let's come back to the point where the flood comes in as well. Then, and obviously the reason for that. Let's just briefly talk about the reason for the flood. A lot of people wouldn't understand that the Nephilim were walking the earth and causing all sorts of carnage. So let's go through that point and the reason why it happened and how it came about.
Right. So you have these two different lineages that biblically are there, the lineage of Cain, and you have the lineage of Seth that come from Adam. But we may even have more races there. And I'm Christian, but I'm also a Christian contrarian, and I like to verify everything myself. And so when I look at day 6 in Genesis 1 with the creation of human in multiples, I look at that as a creation where you have the 4 races, or at least 3 races that are created. Adam is of the same species because the word man and Adam, they're the same word in Hebrew, which is Adam. And that the details in the Adam creation that happened sometime later, including with the creation of Eve sometime after Adam, not at the same time as in day 6, the details, they don't match up to day 6. So you have either a contradiction biblically or you have 2 different creations. But understanding that there's probably 2 creations and knowing that Adam was one of those races or part of one of those races answers where the races come from, right? So it's an important sort of distinction. I looking at how the Bible doesn't contradict itself. I look at that it adds more information, and it goes sometimes against standard dogma, but that's another rabbit hole. But I am a contrarian.
Could it be the Adamness if there was 2 creations creations there. The first trial was almost like, if it's a DNA kind of trial, it was a trial that didn't go right, a beta test. And the second trial was they got it closer to what they wanted.
That's what is said through the alien mythos, and sometimes in some of the Gnostic accounts, that there were several sort of attempts and sort of creations, and whether or not that happened or not, we don't know. But biblically, we get told that humans are created all at the same time and spread around the earth and multiply, male and female, in plural, as opposed to this creation of Adam that's separate, right? And so I would sort of look at that the people in day 6, and we don't know how long after Adam is created. So you could have like 1,000 years biblically for a day, and then you have day 7, so that's 1,000 years. And then most people say, well, then it would have been day 8, then Adam was created, but we're not told that. We don't know how long after that happens. But Adam's created for a special commission and has some details difference in his creation, like the spirit being breathed into him for that commission. So there's something else that is going on there. So I would say what happens with that time frame after day 6 with the creation of humans is that they become followers of the rebellious fallen angels or the gods in polytheism, right? And then you have the creation of Adam, and then you have Cain that is going to rebel and murder Abel, and then he's going to be part of that, become part of those nations that are following the pantheon of the gods. So when he leaves the Eden area and goes east to Nod and builds a city, builds the city for who? And gets a wife. Gets a wife for who? Because there's no sons and daughters born to Adam until he was 130 years and after Seth. So one presumes this is the day 6 people. And that with the knowledge that he had, using, again, the polytheist lens on this, that he would have been able to introduce agriculture to the hunters and gatherers that the people of day 6 are described as in Genesis 1, as opposed to the agrarian society Adam is described of having in Eden. And in most accounts, particularly in the Gnostic accounts and how they adapt the Sumerian accounts into it, Cain becomes a king over these people and a kingly line, and sort of takes that religion and that knowledge and develops the cities and the city center, city state sort of civilization. So you have, I think, a lot more going on before the flood than most people think from a Christian lens, and we need to be open for that. But as a Christian, we still need to measure everything against what the Bible says. But this seems to match up quite well, and so you have these descendants of Cain that have a huge influence on that antediluvian world. And this seems to be the religion of Atlantis, which is looked upon as the helm of world government and the greatest civilization and the home of, by all of its descriptions, the same religion that Enoch had created. So it's the Enochian mysticism, but again, that starts to go sort of evil as well. But they're trying to create a world government. So you have these rival branches that are coming from all of these gods that are kings all over the earth, and they're trying to be like the ruler of the earth, like the sort of a Nephilim Antichrist figure, so to speak, before the world, that they want to put everybody under their rule, their family, and their society. And in the accounts in Critias and Timaeus by Plato, they almost get there, but they're kind of stopped at the time of meeting up with the Greeks. But by that time, they've developed 10 groups of nations as an empire that are spawning from North and South America into Africa, into pieces of Europe, into England and Ireland, and are trying to sort of finish off that sort of conquest. But right after that as well, you have this huge violence that's going on the earth. So that's part of what causes the flood, to get back to the original question that you talked about. So when the Bible talks about there was violence, this is the the violence is caused by the wars between these kingdoms, between these bloodlines, in the arts that are taught to them according to the book of Enoch, where Azazel, the leader of the rebellious angels, is going to teach them how to make weapons. So the arts to making weapons. He's going to teach them how to organize an army. He's going to teach them the battle tactics. The complete arts of war is taught to them. And so this is the violence aspect is going to spread, and they're going to turn on themselves, and they're going to turn on humankind in this conquest. But there's more that's going on. The Bible says the whole earth had become corrupted. And so we talk about this technology that we might just be catching up to now. And that word corrupt in the Bible is rooted in the Hebrew word shakath. And that word means to destroy, to ruin, to decay, to spoil, to change. And corrupt is the violence and the corruption, and the whole earth had become corrupt. And what that means, if you think about that, the whole earth, and it's when the earth, I mean, you could look at that as the waters, which is possible as well, but for sure the land mass, we can say with that description that the plant genome has been manipulated.
Yep.
And the DNA of human beings has been altered either through intermarriage with the bloodlines of the giants or through DNA manipulation. And so the whole world has been corrupted, not only by the violence, but the knowledge that has been going on. And that this is the reason then that God calls the animals to the ark, because he knows the ones that haven't been corrupted. And they're going to start the new world with these uncorrupted animals. And he chooses 8 who haven't been physically corrupted and are spiritually aligned as well from a biblical perspective. You get the same sort of accounts in all the flood stories, but just from a polytheist lens. And that if you now think about what I said about the 4 races, then you can look at the 4 races coming from the 4 couples. So the wives would probably be of a different race of each of the 4 males: Noah, Ham, Japheth, and Shem. So that's how you would probably have the 4 races show up after the flood, just not to leave that detail sort of hanging out there. But that's what's going on. And the knowledge had the ability to build things like the pyramids before the flood. And, you've got testimony, and you've got, not testimony, but you've got, like in the stone of Menes or Narma, you have a depiction of the 52-degree slope Great Pyramid that's dated to 3000 BC. So even on a secular chronology, that's before the flood at 2950 BC to 3000 or 2450 biblically. You have that being accredited to the knowledge. This is what the Masons have recorded. The knowledge to build the pyramids comes from Enoch, son of Cain. So it's that level of knowledge that we can't build that pyramid today with that same specification, with those same weight of stones, to the technical degree of the masonry, to the sacred geometry that's put into it, to the astronomical alignments that's all put into it. And that's not the only megalith that they did. They built all these other megaliths around the world in the various civilizations. And that's why I say we're just catching up to that to this day, and we're starting to get into that DNA manipulation and creating the chimera, which is the word that they're using for it, which was out of the Greek mythology for not only the creation of all of these fantastic creatures that are talked about, like centaurs and Pegasus and so many other ones, but the chimera was completely different. It had multiple animals made into one. And this requires probably DNA manipulation as well. I think probably also required the corrupted spirit of the fallen angels that was illegally passed on. So there's something sexual or something from them that brings life. Because even today we can create everything in a laboratory, but we can't have it live, because it dies. It doesn't have that spirit that's going to keep it alive. So there's something from the gods and the fallen angels or the aliens in the alien mythos that's being added into that mix as well.
So how does the bloodlines? There's obviously the if you call it Gilgamesh or you call it the flood. I mean, I know there is difference, especially at the micro level. They are different. There's a lot of differences going on there, but the general themes on the macro level are very similar. So how did this bloodline of Cain, survive the flood and come out the other end when it wasn't supposed to, possibly?
Yeah, and I would look at it, you can certainly look at it from the bloodlines of Cain because of the human females that were used to create the giants. So from a matriarchal kind of perspective, right? And that's an important understanding in the dualism of the allegory of the bloodlines. The female allegorization and or the female goddess is allegorized in the matriarchal fairy bloodlines and or owl bloodlines, and the patriarchal bloodlines of the parents, parent male gods, and the offspring Nephilim males would be the dragon or the raven bloodlines, which are again classic sort of occult symbols, but understand that's part of the allegory for the bloodlines. So typically you would understand Cain's descendants not surviving the flood. And if because it's only the descendants of Seth from a human perspective.
Yep.
But through the Nephilim bloodline, if the Nephilim did survive the flood, then you could make that argument. Typically, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it gives us two scenarios as to creations of giants and how they show up after the flood. Biblically, we're not told how it happens. With a smoking gun verse, people like to point to a couple words here and there, but we don't have the same smoking gun verse as we do before the flood. But there's something distinct about the giants after the flood as well. So, and it's important to understand this as we talk about how the bloodlines then come out. So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have Gilgamesh being created from a goddess and a human male in this case. And because Lugalbanda is his father, right? And he's the king of Uruk. And so one presumes then that Lugalbanda as being the father, this mother goddess, this bull imagery of a mother goddess is going to be the mother and Lugalbanda the father. And he is created in a second incursion after the flood, right? And Enkidu is created the same way. But within the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have another set of stories that are in there that includes the flood story. And the flood story has what they call the Sumerian Noah there. And his name is, then depending on whether or not which translation that you're reading, and of course Gilgamesh will have a different name in the other translation as well, but Ziusudra or Upnapishtim are typically the two names for the Sumerian Noah, and they're classified as 2/3 God and 1/3 human, just as that's the same description of Enkidu and Gilgamesh. But these are kings before the flood, and he's the archetypical king before the flood, and all of his family are 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and there's all of his family are on the ark as well. And so you get a survival story on the ark, and you get a second incursion story in the epic as well. So you get two ways that they cross the flood. I tend to lean more towards a second incursion biblically, but I'm open because we don't get that perfect sentence in there that would officially say there was a second incursion, and I have a great document where I make that case that I like second incursion, but they do show up after the flood. So you could have an antediluvian line, or you could also have a Rephaim line. And biblically, if you wanted to make a case for Nephilim surviving the flood, you could say that when it says in Genesis 6 and Genesis 7 that when God brought the flood, and it literally says he destroyed everything he created.
Yeah.
Right? Well, he didn't create the giants.
Mm-hmm.
The fallen angels did. The gods did. So if they wanted to take them off the earth, hide them in the earth, create arks for them, that could have happened.
Yeah.
And so we need to be open to that. But biblically, it's a lot easier case to make that there's a second incursion than there's survival of these giants. So when we look biblically after the flood, you have the Rephaim. And Rephaim is used 25 times in the Old Testament. Twice it shows up as the word Rephaim in Genesis 14 and Genesis 15 as people. The other times it's just the word giant. Nephilim only shows up after the flood twice in the same verse in Numbers 13:33, where you get the embellished part of the report about the Anakim, who are said to be the descendants of giants, the Nephilim. The other time it's in Genesis 6:4. But the Anakim are not Nephilim, because in Deuteronomy 2, they're said to be giants. That goes back to the word Rapha and Rephaim. And that earlier up in the details of the report that's given by Joshua and Caleb, what it says is that you have the Anak, and it names 3 kings of them, Sheshai, Talmai, and Ahiman. These are the descendants of Anak, not the descendants of giants, the descendants of Anak. And Anak were long-necked giants, as it's defined. And I call them the Anakim, just as the Nephilim, I am is the male plural. And so these are post-Diluvian giants. But what Numbers 13:33 testifies to is the veracity to the belief of the Israelites in these giants that were before the flood. And they used that term for Nephilim because they wanted to terrify the Israelites not to go into the covenant land and have to fight against these. And so we take it from that they were probably bigger and more fearsome than the post-Diluvian giants, but they are distinct. There's one other place, just if somebody's checking the word for giant that's used in the Old Testament. There's one time in Job 16:14 where it talks about a giant. That goes back to the Hebrew word Gibor, and Gibborim is the male plural, which is the same word that is used to describe the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4, where it says the mighty ones. That's the word Gibborim. So that could be a giant as well, but it doesn't distinguish the difference between Rephaim and Nephilim. And it doesn't mean Gibborim are a separate race of giants, because it just means the mighty ones that the Nephilim were called, right? Yeah. So it's more of a description. And in the Old Testament, it's used 158 times, but it's not always used for a giant. It can also be used just for a human being, or it's the strength of God. It's used to describe angels. So you have to be careful with the application, because all Hebrew and Greek words tend to have multiple meanings. So you have to choose the right one for the right sentence, and that it doesn't conflict with what it says elsewhere in the Bible. So these giants show up after the flood, bottom line. And yeah. So what they do is they do the same thing that they did before the flood. And they're the aboriginals. They show up before biblically the Canaanites show up into the land of the covenant after Babel. These are the tribes that are aboriginals, and it's who the Canaanites will intermarry with, and they're there before. And it's important to understand that. And that so after Babel and after Nimrod, you have the Rephaim because of their size. They're not as big as the original Nephilim, but they're at least, 10 feet to 14 feet tall. And you could make a case, if you think that the sizes described for Gilgamesh are accurate, he's 11 cubits and he's the king of Uruk. So a cubit is either a standard 18 inches or a royal cubit 21 inches. And as Josephus laid out in his works, when you're measuring the size of the giants, which were the kings, you use the royal cubit. So that would have made Gilgamesh just over 19 feet tall. And 7 feet wide. Now, biblically, we don't get them that big. We get Og's bed as being 9 cubits. And that would be using a royal cubit about 16 feet. And it is 4 cubits wide, which would be 7 feet. So Og would be a little bit smaller as the last of the Rephaim, as he's described, the last of the giants. But he's probably using a royal cubit 14 feet, maybe a little bit taller. And wide, he would be probably, 5 to 6 feet wide. And that's why you have these terms that will go back to the Hebrew word for stout. And just as the bed is essentially a 2-to-1 width ratio. That was the width ratio of the giants. When they're called stout, or words that go back to stout, that doesn't mean fat. That means broad, wide, and strong, as that gets defined. Particularly with the strong ones, when it's talking about the terrible ones in Isaiah 25. That's where you really start to flesh that out. And in some other places as well that I do cover in the upcoming book. So they were thought to be an average width ratio of 2-to-1, where the humans would be 3-to-1. So they weren't just tall. These were broad, muscular, adept, dexterous, perfect warriors. And so even Goliath, 400 years after the Exodus, over 1,000 years after the flood, and with diluted probably bloodlines, he is still 6 cubits in a span. So as a royal cubit, and he's the king of Gath, which is why David took 5 stones. He was prepared to kill 5 giants that day of the Philistine Pentapolis. Didn't think he was going to miss. Those 5 were chosen for each of the 5 kings. He would be measured at 11 feet 3 inches using a royal cubit, which was, the average Israelite probably was 5 to 5.5 feet tall back then. So more than twice as tall. And he's described as stout and strong as well. And that you have, even using a standard cubit, he would be 9 feet 9 inches tall. So these were monstrous beings, and which is why they're able to usurp the kingships, right? And when they usurp the kingships, they start to have offspring. But one of the difficulties with the Rephaim after the flood is they don't have the same fertility capability. So when you get into the Ugaritic text, which is really important sort of parallel from a biblical perspective for the Rephaim, because it uses the original Semitic language, where Rephaim comes out of the word Repayu or Repium, depending on which person is translating it. They are doing fertility rituals to bring back Baal and Ashtaroth to create more giant demigods, because they have a fertility issue. And by that time, Baal and Ashtaroth aren't coming back. They're not going to produce more, because if they did produce those giants after the flood, which seemingly they did, because these are the Baalim of Mount Hermon. These are the Canaanite gods. These are the post-Diluvian reign of the offspring gods. If they created giants, they would have been sent to the abyss for crimes against creation and crimes against humanity as well. So they would have been gone. So the giants then, if they're going to reproduce and they have dwindling numbers, they're going to have to now intermarry with humans, even though they're quite a bit bigger. And they are going to introduce a female stock and only use that as required, but that becomes a tradition all along the line, because if you intermarry too much, you develop blood diseases like Habsburg jaw or hemophiliac diseases and things like that we have in the modern time.
Called Habsburg jaw for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. And so once you start bringing in human DNA and diluting those pure bloodlines, even though they're trying to intermarry to keep it pure, and they keep genealogies into the midst of times on this to establish where they fit in terms of that purity level and the ennobling or the scioning of those bloodlines, you're going to take on more human traits, and that's going to bring down the size, and that's going to bring down, bring into more of the human look, as opposed to the look of the particular god that would have produced them. And so we see this in accounts in the Egyptian accounts with people called the Shazu that are on the tablets, and they were 7 to 9 feet tall. These are hybrid Rephaim humans, not quite as tall, but taller than the average Israelite. They're also known coming out of the Eastern Sumerian tradition and through the Hyksos in those bloodlines, the Amau and the Shamau, same hybrid types of beings. And we get told of these in a very sort of interesting way in the Bible of the hybrids. These are the ones that are talked about in the report out of Canaan by the spies or the scouts that we talked about earlier, where they saw the Enoch. They also saw people taller than the Israelites that are distinct from the Anakim. And then this is repeated again in Deuteronomy 1, where there's the Anakim kings, and then there's the people that are taller than the Israelites. We get the Amorites in Deuteronomy 1. We get more nations, which are Canaanite nations that are listed in the Scouts account, like the Hivites, for example, and the Canaanites. And in Genesis 1:10 and First Chronicles 1, you get something called the Table of Nations. And that's the 70 patriarchs that produce the nations. So Canaan is the patriarch for the Canaanite nation, right? Shem is the Semites, right? And so you have 12 tribes of the Canaanites that moved into the covenant land, where the Rephaim are talked about biblically, as well as the Ugaritic text. And that's why it's the same religion. They have the same gods. So you have now 3 patriarchs that are listed by name: Canaan, Heth, and Sidon. But then you get 9 families, no patriarch. And in all the other genealogies in the Table of Nations, you don't have those families. They have direct patriarchs that started them. So you have the son of, right, and creates another nation that would be listed. But there's no more genealogy after that. And that word family, it can mean family, but it can also mean a different kind or a different species.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. And so what you don't get in the Table of Nations are Rephaim or Nephilim patriarchs, because they're not in there. This is the human family. But something changes there. They're marrying a Rephaim patriarch, and the name comes from a particular Rephaim. And so we know this, that, like, Amorites, and I talk about this in the next book. I'll talk about the Nephilim and the god that would have produced the Amorite people, and where they get that name Amar from, which is the first part of Amorite. And what's also interesting, as we look at the different Rephaim creating these different nations, and that you have multiple nations for the Rephaim that are listed in the Bible. You have the Avi, you have the Hivim, you have the Horim, you have the Zamzuzim, you have the Zuzim, and you have many, many more. I won't list them all, but they don't have any patriarchs. But we do get a couple of patriarchs, just as some people look at the word Rapha, which is the root word for giant, for the post-diluvian giants. I am is the male plural. Rapha is thought in some cases to be the patriarch of the Rephaim, which is where they take their name from. And so when you look at Goliath's account and his genealogy, he and 4 other giants come from one particular giant, and it's like a genealogy, and that's the word Rapha. So is he of the lineage of Rapha, or is that just meaning his father was a giant and was a Rephaim? Hard to know. But typically people think of Rapha as being sort of the root name for the post-diluvian giants. But there's another one that really sort of underscores what I'm talking about, is the Anakim are giants, are Rephaim. They're like a different tribe of Rephaim, just as the Avim are like a different tribe of the Avim. And that you have a fellow by the name of Arba, who is the greatest of the Anakim, and he is the patriarch, as he's talked about in the book of Joshua, as being the patriarch of the Anakim, and he is not listed in the Table of Nations. So none of these other giant nations are listed in the Table of Nations, just as you get other giants, whether or not it is the Cherithim, or it is the Gerzim, or the Cadmonim, or the Kenazim, and all of these other nations don't have patriarchs, and they're always listed amongst the giants in the Old Testament. So sorry, anyways, I'll finish it off. I know I got down on a tangent there.
Right.
So they're going to create dynasties for the kings, and they're going to rule over the people, and they're going to rule through the divine right of inheritance. That is the divine right of the rule, like the Stuart kings claim, that they get from their god, a specific god out of the pantheon of gods, the divine right to rule, which typically goes back to the Baalim. And these are going to be the dynastic families that come down through history, and that intermarriage is going to continue to keep the bloodlines as pure as possible, or to add ennoblement to it with other bloodlines, and then adding in outside bloodlines as they go.
That was my kind of next question, how they go from the physical giants to, okay, that's diluting these different tribes.
Yeah.
It's actually diluting, but the secret knowledge is carrying on. These they know where they came from, and there's very, very small amount of a few thousand people, but what they call it 13 bloodlines. I mean, there could be more than that, and they're intermarrying. And we obviously have the British Royals as one of the most well-known ones, but you have the Merovingian bloodline. You have all of these different ones. European, they seem to congregate in Europe, in European bloodlines at the moment. I'm sure there's ones in China as well, but that's where it's all coming from. These guys have a completely different understanding of where they come from, of history. So how does that information go from, say, let's go back to kind of the time of Jesus in the Middle East? How does that information go from his time, and what was he trying to do in his life to try and maybe reveal some of this stuff?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And just before I get to that, let me give one example of a transition in terms of a description, in terms of how they're losing some of the size and some of the looks, but how they're also maintaining some of the looks.
Okay.
So you have Akhenaten as a bloodline of the Rephaim out of Egypt, and he's from the Amarna dynasty. And you get depictions of Akhenaten that are really quite strange to look at. And you get this protruding chin, and you get these high cheekbones, you get these thin lips, and you get these large wraparound eyes that were thought to glow within the understanding of giants from all cultures. And you have this elongated skull, and you look at him, and he's got this serpentine look. Now, the giants are created from the Watchers. Yeah. And the Watchers are the archangels around the throne. They are the seraphim, they are the cherubim, and the Ophanim, which are described in the book of Enoch. And these are the ones that are slightly different than the cherubim in Ezekiel 1 and 10 are in the wheels. Ophan is one of the words for wheel, and I am is the male plural. That's where Enoch gets Ophanim from, is one of the Watchers. The chief of the Watchers are the seraphim angels. These are six-winged angels that work before the altar of God within the fiery stones as ministering spirits and dictating governance and abidance of the law and from that sort of directive from the monotheist religion of worshiping the God Most High. They also have a serpentine face. So these are dragons. These are heavenly dragons. And that's why you have so many gods around the world that are represented as serpents. There are other kinds of gods as well, but the most predominant are the seraphim. And also, the kings are also represented in the antediluvian times and shortly after the flood. They're actually called serpents because they're the demigod offspring. And the gods and the fallen angels actually create a body, an oikotarian, for their spirit to dwell in, to pass on the DNA so that they can pass on the traits, which is how they're able to create spurious offspring. And they're going to have looks that look just like them. So if you can imagine this look of Akhenaten, and then or even Google it, which is even better, you're going to see a serpentine face there. And he has this elongated skull because, again, that was a typical look. And if you look at the Hyksos kings or, the Sumerian kings, they have these headdresses all the time that are covering up that serpentine head of theirs. So you have this trait, a physical trait that's diluting sort of over time. And that's what sort of happens. And so by the time you get to the time of Jesus, he's not really there to take on where these people come from or their lineages. He's there for one reason. He's part of the resolution to the angelic rebellion that created the giants to destroy humankind, and the Edomites are created as that resolution. So he's there to announce that from the time of his resurrection, and why he goes to the spirits in the abyss prison, the fallen angels who procreated and created these giants, when he's still in the grave, he's telling them, when I rise on the Sunday, your rebellion is over. Your fate is sealed, and so is the fate of your spurious offspring. And we know the angels didn't anticipate that from the book of Corinthians, because if they had, it says they wouldn't have had him crucified. So they didn't know everything. They know a lot, but they don't know everything. And so he's there to do the first part of his mission, is to become a human being in a different way than the Nephilim are created. He's not created in a sexual nature. He is created by the Holy Spirit, creating this oiketerion, which means a dwelling place for the spirit. It's the soul and the body within the physical world, and the spirit comes from the other world. And he's there to have the Holy Spirit creates the oiketerion. His body will enter, his spirit will enter that oiketerion, so that he can come atone as the creator of the world at God's command for all of the sins in the world, except for the sins created against the Holy Spirit that provides life, which is why the fallen angels and many of the giants will be going to the lake of fire to be punished forever, as what happens in the last 3.5 years with the mark of the beast, different rabbit hole. So Jesus is there for that part of the commission, and to help put that seed in place that's going to help create more people, that is going to have their names not erased from the book of life that was started from before creation. And the only time that we see him really addressing the world order that's there, and just as we're told by the apostles, they own this world until the end time. Satan is the god of this world. He's the prince of this world. They have their own council of gods, as Psalms 82 talks about, and they rule over all of the nations. And their spurious offspring are part of that hierarchy, implementing their ways. So what Jesus does is he goes up to Mount Hermon, into Caesarea, where he names Peter will be the rock of the church that he's going to build on. And he's speaking to the Pan Temple. He's speaking at the Rock of the Gods. He's speaking at the gateway to Hades, the cave of Hades, that he is going to start his church that is going to change everything after his resurrection. So he's just putting things in place. And he's addressing it, but not in ways that people necessarily will say, well, why didn't he say he's a giant or he's an evil bloodline? He looks at the whole world as being corrupted. He looks at the whole world as being run by these corrupted evil beings. And Herod, who is trying to kill Jesus, just as Satan is trying to get him to convert, and he's offering him all the kingdoms of the world. Yeah. And everybody's trying to kill him, which they eventually do. But of course, he rises, just in case anybody is saying I'm going somewhere differently with that. He knows who King Herod is. King Herod is an Edomite king over the king of the Jews. And people don't realize this. And he takes over from the Maccabees because of the influence that he has had with the Romans in with helping them. And he comes out of a royal bloodline, but it's an Edomite royal bloodline. And the Edomites are accepted into Judean society when the Maccabean kings, I think John Hyrcanus is the one who's credited with conquering the Edomites and then bringing them to be in like Jewish people as part of a vassal state sort of thing. But the bloodlines are kept. He has an Edomite bloodline that goes back to the Horim, and who the Horim are the giants that are in the southern part of Canaan. And they are the ones that the descendants of Esau are going to intermarry with in Genesis 36. And they're called the Alephs, or the Elven, or the fairy kings of Edom. They're going to intermarry with the dukes of Edom that have been there since the beginning, since the flood. And they're going to produce a new hybrid race between Esau's son Eliphaz and Timnah, who is a Horim daughter of Seir, which goes back to the Hebrew word Satir, which is a devil goat god, which is a degraded seraphim watcher, I-ear, as its watcher shows up in Daniel, is I-Y-R, and S-A, it's a compounded word with S-A meaning hairy or shaggy. It's a shaggy goat god. Seraphims weren't goat gods, they were seraphims. They were degraded afterwards. And he takes his name from that. And Timnah is one of his daughters, and they start the Amalekites, who show up after the Amalekim are in the War of Giants in Genesis 14 and 15. I know I'm covering a lot of details, but my point of the matter is this is the Edomite bloodline that is intermarrying with the Horim that is going to produce King Herod, who is trying to kill Jesus, both as a child and then as what happens after Herod dies with the crucifixion. But what's important to understand here is the Amalekites, the hybrid branch that are created from Timnah and Eliphaz, they're the nation that attacks Israel when they first come out of the Exodus. They're trying to usurp the inheritance of the Messianic blessing. They're trying to inherit the birthright and the full blessing of Abraham as well. So Isaac receives his full blessings from Abraham, and he has a son named Jacob, who is going to have a brother named Esau. And Esau is the older brother who is supposed to receive these blessings. So it goes Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Jacob, who changes his name to Israel later at God's behest, he essentially steals or tricks those birthrights away. So what the Amalekites are trying to do is wipe Israel from the face of the earth, because if they do, they would inherit that back.
Right.
And so King Herod is doing the same thing. He is trying to eliminate the Judaic society. He's going to turn it into polytheism if he gets his way, and he wants to murder the Messiah.
So how are we seeing this play out now? Let's just, before we kind of wrap up, how are we seeing this play out from the 2,000 years ago in the Middle East and to now? And we're seeing, obviously, transhumanism is coming about. It's quite clearly they're trying to either preempt or push an end times prophecy in the Middle East with the Solomon's Temple, the third temple on Temple Mount. There's obviously an element of this prophecy that they're trying to bring about through transhumanism, through the technocracy, in their own way now, the technology, through these bloodlines. How do you see this happening now as we kind of go into, especially the last couple of years where things have really, really ramped up? This is something that most people, everyday people you meet in the co-op, haven't got a clue about any of this stuff to any level. How do you see that? How are these bloodlines now? Where are they now, and how are they kind of trying to push this towards its end kind of goal?
So the first thing that people who haven't dug a lot into this whole subject I think they need to understand is that just as all the religions of the world have their own stories of prehistory from a polytheist lens, they have the same end time type of prophecies, and that they see a different outcome from it than the monotheist perspective. But people don't realize is they want to bring the end time about. They want to have this showdown, and they want to start this new age, this new Atlantis. And they feel the only way that they can do this is through world government and a world religion, which is the old Enochian religion that we started off at the beginning of the show with. And that they're going to want to be able to what they call vibrate or evolve into godhood. So they're going to offer some sort of goddess status as part of this movement into this new age. So what we have is all of these different bloodlines, not just in the West. You name, like, there's 13 families that are the top level in terms of who runs the West and at the top of the secret societies. So when you hear the number 33 that's below them, that's like 33 families. So it's expanded, but the top ones are 13, and the committee of 300 are 300 families as well. Okay. And then the Rosicrucians is sort of the intersection to the lower secret societies with the purebloods at the top level. So if we understand then that there's bloodlines all over the world that you alluded to. and that they're still active to this day for the most part. So, for example, you have the old Tartarian Kievan kings that were the original czars.
Yep.
And that name is the Putyanin. And the name Putin comes out of nowhere in the 1850s.
Right.
And what they did, and I think that's either his grandfather or his great grandfather, depending on which historian that you're reading. And that the tradition back then was that if you had offspring outside of the marriage, you couldn't give them the full name. But there they would give part of the name. So Putin is part of the Putyanin name, and that they moved from Kiev. His father moves to St. Petersburg, which how he ends up in Europe. So understand, he's trying to rebuild the old Tartarian Empire of the Russians, right? Of the Kievan czars. And so and there's probably other bloodlines that are important in that part of the world as well. But they've been, badly bruised with the wars, and those are rivalries. And I'll come back to the rivalries in a few minutes. But you have in China, as one other example, and I'll maybe just touch on something just to give more of a global look as well. But with the Chinese history, you have the dragon creator gods. These are the seraphim angels. And you have kings that are created both before and after the flood. So same story. And they become all of the Chinese dynasties, which is the Shah dynasty or the Li family bloodline. And communism takes over and wipes out the dynasties, but they don't wipe out all of those ancient bloodlines, because they got thousands and thousands of years of bloodline people there. And the western part of the Li dynasty, of the Shah dynasty, is called the Shah, and its short version is ZI for Xi. You have in China today somebody who's running China who has the name Xi Jinping. He is of that Western Shah bloodline, and he's going to recreate his ancient empire. So we need to look behind the scenes as to what's going on with these rival bloodlines. And they set up all of the kingships that come out of those bloodlines, out of the original, dragon kings. So that the Yamamoto dynasty is a branch of the original Chinese and all the Southeast kings. So you're going to see some other bloodlines as well becoming more prominent out of Asia and Southeast Asia. When the Spanish and the Portuguese invaded Central America and South America, everybody thinks all of the bloodlines were destroyed, all the kings. They only killed the current king. They didn't kill the wives and the rest of the family and the sons and the brothers and sisters. And all of their nobility rights were reinstated by both the Portuguese and the Spanish by 1525. And then they started to intermarry with the bloodlines of the Portuguese and the Spanish. So you have the Ingaroka, for example, which are still common bloodlines that are in South America that go back to the Inca dynasty. So you've got bloodline families all over the world. So you've got rivals going on all the time. So if you want to look at what I mean by a rival, World War I was an inter-family war. You had the Windsors, who were originally the Hanovers from Germany, the Kaisers. They're cousins with the Kaisers, basically. They're cousins with the Habsburgs. They're cousins with the Tsars. This was an inter-family blood war for control, right? And so this is still going on to this day. And the reason is, I don't know, did you ever see the Highlander movies?
No, I haven't. I know about them, but I haven't seen the Highlander movies.
Okay,
no.
well, they're about these warrior type Nephilim type people. They're not shown as giants, but they are immortals from around the world, and it's from the fairy sort of allegorical basis, where they're going to take their head and receive in the quickening all of the power of them, but there can only be one. And at the end of their sort of story is you have one of them that's ruling over the world. It's an Antichrist type figure that comes from these immortals, from the demigods. And so same with what's going to happen with the world government. There can only be one ruling dynasty.
Yeah.
And then there will be other families, but they'll be subservient. And if they're not careful, what tends to happen is these tyrants tend to wipe out all rivals, right?
Mm.
This has been going on throughout their history, and they work directionally towards the goal, but they all have their eye on, we want to become the family. And so Jesus tells us there will be many antichrists in the end time, as well as in the epistles of John, we get that as well. So we're going to see a number of these guys rise up, but what they're doing right now is they're positioning for their place in this world government. And an interesting group that was started in the 1960s called the Club of Rome, which is made up of bloodline people and super ennobled bloodline people that reports into the Committee of 300 of bloodline families. They were created to help the world form into 10 groups of nations, 10 trading blocks, 10 spheres of influence, as what you're hearing today, which is the same number as the Atlantean Empire, right, as we talked about. Because as in Francis Bacon, as a Rosicrucian, he wrote the book, The New Atlantis, that the Royal Society, another rabbit hole we don't have time to go down to today, and the connections there, was a end time sort of story where you have this polytheist religion that is going to be working in harmony with science, as it did in the ancient times, which will be part of this world government. And so they allegorize it as the New Atlantis because that's the one that they idolize, right? It's
the golden age.
The golden age. Yeah. Now, in the book of Daniel, you get several prophecies that have 10 toes, 10 horns, and 10 kings. As you forward that into Revelation, this is the makeup of the world government, these 10 kings. So it's going to be 10 rulers from these 10 groups of nations. So if you can imagine, let's say, Russia having their sphere of influence and their bloodline, China having their sphere of influence and their bloodlines, Japan perhaps, and go around the world and split it up 10 ways. And so America would have its influence, whether or not that's part of the British, with the Brexit and everything. And Germans are probably going to have theirs that goes down Central Europe, and maybe France has another one. But that's how the world is being imagined to be being split up amongst those bloodlines. If you want to understand what's going on today, you have to understand what happened in prehistory and who the bloodlines are and how they dominate the world, not only through religion, but through the secret societies and through all the economic levers. The Committee of 300 controls all the economic levers in the world, whether or not it's the IMF or the World Bank. It's all going to answer up into that. And the Jesuits are the secret society and the bloodline order from the black nobility within the church. They've got, a lot of things in place, but they're struggling to get it done on the timetable that they want to do it. And it's got to do with the rivalries. And it also has to do with, if you're a Christian, that they're not going to get it done until the ordained time, but they're going to continue to work at it. So they'll accept the ordained time, but they're trying to bring it about on a time not of the timetable of the God of the Bible, but they want that rendezvous with destiny, and they want that 10 kings because it's that 10 king empire that makes the way, and the universal religion with it, that creates everything, puts everything in place for Antichrist to just step in and take.
That part, obviously the round table, the point in the round table, there's no head of the table, so they're all equal. That's the whole point, obviously, of having a round table. And obviously, I think we had knights at the round table as well.
Yeah.
So just to end it then.
Same as the ring lords in prehistory at Nippur.
Yeah, that's the whole point. There is no top of it or bottom of it. They're equal. Yeah. But as you say, there's only going to be one. So, and then the Antichrist, who do you think? Is there got an idea of who this could be? Is this person here already, or are we looking 100 years in the future, or is it technology? Would it be AI? Would it be? What is your kind of take on your theory there?
Well, I think biblically we understand it as a person who receives a fatal head wound. So it's going to be a human of some sort, whether or not a hybrid but it's a human of some form that's going to fake the resurrection with that mortal head wound. Right. And what we also know is that with Antichrist is that he is going to receive his power from the 10 kings. They're going to hand it over to him, right? So it's going to come out of that. So we need to have that first. And we also know that the bloodlines all are trying to have their representative be the one, right?
Yeah.
And within the bloodlines of Europe, for example, I've been told by several sources that they have 3 antichrists all ready to go, raised from childhood, as all the bloodlines are. They're initiated. Their bloodlines are initiated at a depth before they're even an adult. They just can't take the title until somewhere in the mid-20s.
You can
or a little
see
bit
that
beyond.
through all you got to do is look at the pictures of Prince William when he was born and Rosemary's Baby's dress. Prince George, I think it is, Rosemary's Baby dress as well, with the red dress with the white bit around the top. All the signs are there, and I think there's another one as well. So they're plotting these things out. If you look at Rosemary's Baby, that's a lot of signifiers in that film.
But we also get names like, the Grand Monarch is kind of one of the French sort of bloodlines that will introduce himself in Geezer's castle under the Grand Monarch, or the Grand Arch there. He'll walk through there as his announcement as part of one of the bloodlines out of the European families. You got to think that the Windsors are trying to position as well with their ennobled bloodlines. There are Antichrist names that come out of other religions, like out of the Shia of the Muslims. That's the Mahdi. So expect something out of there. You've got Lord Maitreya, or the new Buddha. So expect this. You also have Gog as part of the Gog War. And Gog, in that end time war that happens just before the midpoint of the last 7 years, when that goes back to Greek and to Hebrew, it is an archetypical Antichrist figure. And he's going to have a war after these 10 kings arise, and that he is going to have a war that is going to be like Armageddon. And I think that's the Revelation 9 war, and it's what Antichrist will use to come to power on. So that's why I say you got to be careful with some of the many Antichrists that are going to be jockeying for position. There's one group that has a couple of different branches to it, which is very interesting, that comes out of Europe, and it has to do with the Paon, de Bouillon, Anjou bloodlines that have taken their genealogies back to the Merovingians, who we've talked about earlier in the show, that also were thought to be the most ennobled bloodline of the time. And they had scion bloodlines from several different sort of Nephilim or Rephaim families. And also they are thought to have scioned into their bloodlines descendants of King Saul. They have descendants of King David, and allegedly through Mary and Jesus, because in the Gnostic belief system, Jesus didn't die on the cross, and through Mary Magdalene created 3 sons. One, Josephus, is the one who gets taken to Glastonbury and intermarries through the Camelot dynasty. And then through Aragon, as you follow that genealogy, just skipping over a few generations, will marry into the Merovingian dynasty through Amenemhat. So they sort of have that Antichrist type of bloodline. So you have the Anjou, who are going to inherit from the Lorraine kings of Godfrey, who is the Knights Templar, and is going to be the leader of Jerusalem, and is elected so after taking Jerusalem. He dies after a year, but Baldwin, his brother, takes over, also of Lorraine. And then Baldwin II, a cousin from Edessa, will be the third one. And then it goes over to the folk of Anjou. And I won't go through all of but they take the title, starting with Baldwin I as the king of Jerusalem. And what's important about that bloodline is that they take their Benjamite bloodlines into account when taking on that title. And that means to them is that Joshua, in the time of the Exodus, gave Jerusalem to the Benjamites. And through their alleged bloodlines, through King Saul, they're claiming their title as the king of Jerusalem, where Antichrist will be crowned. And so this will pass down through the lines. It'll go through the Savoy Anjou as well, as well as the Lorraine Anjou, because the three families, the Payon, Anjou, the Folk of Anjou, and de Bouillon were kings from the Lorraine region. They're going to hang on to that King of Jerusalem title, but there will be this rival claim all the way through, because they all want to be that family. So it goes through. The King of Jerusalem title will go from after the loss of Jerusalem over into Hungary, which are intermarried with the Lorraine dynasties, and then it's going to pass over to the Lorraine dynasty, and then over to the Habsburg dynasty. So the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty, they all claim the King of Jerusalem title. You just got to Google it, and you'll see how it follows on this lineage. And they held on to that for quite a while. Then it passed on to the Bourbon family, which is the royal family of Spain through King Juan Carlos, and Philippe now has that title. They want to use that crown title as their legitimacy to be the one who's going to be crowned at the abomination in the end time. So look for those two rival bloodlines as well to make a claim. The Stuarts have all of these bloodlines as well, that passed off also into the Windsor family, but they were the most ennobled bloodline at their time. And that they have a tradition that there will be, a descendant of Bonnie Prince Charlie who's going to rise up and be the king of the Scots again, and and generally through the Jacobite sort of movement is where that mythos comes from, and be that Antichrist figure. So there's lots of families that are rivals with it, but there's many bloodline families, right? And when you're talking about 300 of them, I think you got to focus in on the 13, but we don't always get a static establishment as to who those 13 families are. But I think you can certainly, look at the St. Clair bloodline is another one, which is the Norse bloodlines that become the St. Clairs who create Freemasonry. And you have a Henry St. Clair who was a battle partner of Hugh the Great de Payon at the time of the Crusade, so part of the creation of the Kings of Jerusalem title. So there's a number of families. So it's really hard to say which one's going to rise to the top, because they all want to do it.
It's insane, isn't it, that how far this goes back, and this whole world is going on why people go to the co-op and go to Asda, do their shopping. They have no idea about the world they actually live in. It's been absolutely incredible, Gary, and I definitely want to get you back on, because there's so much more we could talk about here. And I've taken up an hour of your time, and that's a tour de force of people. Can we talk about, just before we go then, and let's talk about the Nephilim conference that you'll be attending in London, I believe.
Yeah,
soon.
so it's going to be, I think, starting about October 29th or so. I think it's a one-day conference in London. And so look for that. Reverend William Perry is the one that's sponsoring it, and he's done it for a few years. And what's interesting about this conference is that they're taking an approach, and have taken an approach, where they want people from all thought, all belief systems to pool their knowledge and to set aside differences and to talk about the commonalities of what everybody believes, and to be able to put more information that's out there. So I will be speaking on that. And I've been assigned to take on the one of the topics most people shy away from. They want me to describe what they looked like. So I'll be doing a complete presentation on that.
Fantastic.
And I talked a little bit about that today. So that's be the first time I'll be at a conference, unless the pestilence returns, for the last 2.5 years, and I miss speaking publicly. So looking forward to doing more of that. I have another book coming out that's a sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy. I said I would never write another book about the Genesis 6 conspiracy, because I have other books I want to write, and I've got another one on the go besides that. But because of the interviews that I do and the social media that I do and the feedback that I get from all sort of different directions, is people want, from a Christian perspective, a lot deeper dive into how much information is in the Bible. So I'm doing a book that really dives in that, targeted specifically at Christians, whereas the first book is certainly targeted at Christians, but I'm also trying to draw people from other thought processes and beliefs to have a look at what might be in the Bible by connecting the dots for them. They might want to look a little bit deeper into the Bible because of that. So it's going to be called, if I get my way with the publisher, Prehistory and Prophecy, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, or something very close to that. And I'm going to connect the allegories of prehistory to prophecy, because if you want to understand end time prophecy, you have to understand the context and the allegories that are built in. And that all comes out of prehistory, because the Edomites are the resolution to the angelic rebellion. That is the sort of the denouement to the end time. So that all sort of wraps up. So it all comes together.
That's fantastic, because we didn't get to that point at the end times, but we kind of did everything all the way and all the way up to where we are today and what might possibly happen with all these different rivalries and these different families. But we didn't talk about specifically what that will look like when it comes about. So that would be great to get you on once the book's ready to go. Let me know, and we'll get you back on and chat about that, and we can do another podcast specifically about the book and the end times and your take on that, because we feel like we've gone up to that point and we've got there and we've got people up to that point and saying that this is about to happen. These are the people involved, but we didn't say what that's going to look like. So just before you go, where can people find your work, find your book, and check out your website?
Just before I get into that, I'm just going to throw something else out in case people want to check out Psalms 21, 1 through or 8 through 10. It talks about this bloodline and these descendants and that are going to be destroyed in the end time. So I don't have it in front of me, but there is a biblical verse that is so appropriate that in the time of the wrath that this fruitful vine is going to be destroyed in the end time. So the best way to get a hold of me is to go to my website, which is the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6, the number 6conspiracy.com. On that website, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters. It's a big book, and it's absolutely loaded with information from the beginning to the end. And even though I have a generous excerpt, it's a small little pittance as to what's in the book. So, but you'll get a good feel for whether or not it's a book for you. But I think if you look through the table of contents, it's going to get your interest up. And so you can purchase that book through the website. And get a signed copy, or you can link over to Amazon.com and get the Kindle version, and or over to Amazon.com for the printed copy as well, or to BarnesandNoble.com, and it's available on most online bookstores. On my website as well, I have an overseas page as well, so I do ship overseas from the website. And I also have a contact the author icon there. So if you want some more information on what we were talking about today, or just ask me a question, get a hold of me through that website is the best way. I tend to run a couple of weeks behind on all of the email traffic that's coming in, but I will get back to you. And or on Messenger on Facebook is probably the other way. And when things settle out in terms on what's going to be permitted and allowed, and on social media, I'll probably do other social media, but I've limited it to Facebook and Messenger for now.
Okay. Perfect. Well, I'll put all the links below. Thank you, Gary, for your time, and then please do go check out the book. And this information is mind blowing to think that this has been going on all the time, and most people, 99% of the world, haven't got a clue about any of this. That blows my mind that there's a whole world going on here, and that to me is the real matrix. So people have no idea really what the world is like and have a clue. So thank you, Gary, for your time, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Terrific.
Goodbye.
Your call is important to us.
Welcome to tonight's show.
You've arrived at your destination. Connecting.